You're no match for me. Loud, flat, certain. Trust me, lady, go find a yoga class. The entire room laughed. Emily Dawson stood on that mat and let them. She let the laughter fill the room, let it land on her. Let him have every second of it. Then she moved. 4 seconds later, Lawson, black belt, regional champion. The man every student in that building wanted to impress was flat on his back, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand what had just happened to him. Emily offered her hand. Yoga, she said quietly, wasn't really my thing. Subscribe to our channel right now and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment, tell us what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Emily Dawson pulled into the parking lot at 6:43 in the morning and turned off the engine. She sat there, the dashboard clock ticked forward. 6:44, 6:45, 6:46. She wasn't afraid. Fear was something Emily understood the way a surgeon understands a scalpel precisely, functionally, without letting it control the hand. What she felt sitting in that car was something closer to reluctance. The particular kind that settles in when a person has spent years being invisible and is about to walk, voluntarily, into a room full of people who would try to read her. She looked at the building, the Academy for Combat Training and Martial Arts, a private facility in Northern Virginia, 40 minutes outside of D.C., with a reputation for producing serious athletes, regional champions, a few national competitors. The kind of place where the walls were lined with trophies and every student walked with a particular confidence that said they had earned something most people hadn't. Emily had earned things most people couldn't imagine. But nobody inside that building knew that, and that was exactly how she wanted it. She had spent the previous night filling out the registration form at her kitchen table. Name, emergency contact, previous training experience. She had stared at that last field for almost 4 minutes before writing one word. None. It wasn't entirely accurate, but it wasn't a lie either. Not in any way that the form was designed to capture. She grabbed her bag from the passenger seat and pushed the car door open. The morning air hit her face cool, still carrying the last edge of early autumn. She breathed it in once deliberately, the way she had trained herself to do before entering any unfamiliar space. One slow breath, take inventory, know where you are. She walked toward the entrance. Inside, the training hall smelled like rubber mats and sweat, and the particular kind of ambition that young athletes carry everywhere they go. Emily stood just inside the doorway for a moment and let the room settle around her. High ceilings, fluorescent lights, a long wall of mirrors on the far side. Students already warming up, maybe 30 of them, ranging from teenagers to people in their mid-30s. Some were running drills, some were stretching in pairs. Some were doing nothing but standing near the front and watching the room, making sure they were being watched back. She recognized the social architecture immediately. Every competitive environment had one, the alphas near the center, the aspirants clustered around them, the nervous newcomers near the walls, the instructors somewhere in between, technically in charge, but performing for the alphas more than anyone else. Moved toward the back. She found a spot near the edge of the mat, dropped her bag and began stretching, slow, deliberate, unremarkable. She had done this her entire adult life, the art of being present without being prominent, taking up exactly the amount of space required and not 1 inch more. In certain operational contexts, that skill had kept her alive. In a training room in Virginia, it simply meant nobody looked at her twice. Until Lawson noticed her. She clocked him before he clocked her. That was simply habit. He was standing near the center of the room with 2 other students, demonstrating a combination technique, moving through the motions with the particular fluency of someone who had done it 10,000 times. Technique was clean. His body mechanics were good. He had real ability. Emily could see that within seconds. But she also saw the thing underneath the ability, the constant low-level performance of it. The way his eyes moved across the room when he was mid-demonstration, checking who was watching. The way he paused just slightly, just barely, whenever someone new entered the space, running a rapid calculation she recognized because she had seen it in certain kinds of men her entire career. Threat or no threat, rival or no rival, worth my attention or not. His eyes swept past her once, dismissed her immediately, moved on. She had expected that. It was fine, it was useful. Actually, the people who underestimated her were always the easiest to work with, because they were the ones most ready to actually learn something. She kept stretching. The class was called to order at 7 o'clock sharp by a junior instructor named Marcus, a compact man in his late 20s with a shaved head and the quiet focus of someone who had been doing this long enough to stop needing to prove it. He ran the warm-up efficiently, called out corrections without embarrassing anyone, and moved the group through the first 40 minutes of fundamental drills with a professionalism that Emily genuinely respected. She followed along. She made herself just slightly slower than she needed to be. Not dramatically, not the kind of slow that draws its own attention, but enough that anyone watching would see someone still learning the patterns. Someone who needed the repetitions. She was learning something. Just not the basics, she was learning the room. The trouble began during the second segment, when Marcus stepped back and Derek stepped forward. It was apparently a regular rotation, senior students leading sections of the class. Derek moved to the front with the easy authority of someone who had done it dozens of times, and Emily watched the room shift toward him immediately. The students who had been half-focused during Marcus's segment suddenly sharpened their attention. Some of them straightened up. One young man in the front row literally adjusted his stance. It told her everything about Derek's position in this social ecosystem. He was the one people wanted to impress. He was the one who decided, in the informal but very real currency of this room, who was worth taking seriously. He began his segment with a lecture on combat psychology, specifically the role of confidence in physical confrontation. It was actually a decent lecture. He had a good instinct for the theatrical, and he paced the room while he talked, making eye contact with different students, keeping energy in the space. Confidence isn't arrogance, he told them. Arrogance is about image. Confidence is about truth. You have to know what you're capable of. You have to believe in your own preparation. Because the moment you second-guess yourself in a real confrontation, the moment doubt gets inside your body, you've already handed the other person an advantage they didn't earn. He paused near the center of the mat. Fear is normal, fear is fine, but hesitation is a choice. And in combat, it's a choice that costs you. The students were nodding. Emily was nodding too. Because he was right. She just wished he understood how deeply right he was and how thoroughly he was about to demonstrate the opposite. He was walking toward the back of the room when his eyes landed on her again. He didn't dismiss her immediately. He slowed. He looked at her for a moment the way certain people look at something that doesn't fit their mental map of the room. Not a long look, not rude in any obvious way, but present, calculating. Then he stopped walking. "Let me ask everyone something," he said, still looking at her. The room's attention followed his line of sight. Emily felt 30 pairs of eyes turn in her direction and kept her face completely neutral. It was not a skill she had learned in a training academy. This was something forged over years of operational environments where showing the wrong expression at the wrong moment had consequences she never wanted to think about again. Derek smiled. It was a friendly smile. She could tell he meant it that way. He wasn't a villain, he wasn't cruel, he was just young and confident, and standing in a room where everyone was watching, and he had found something he thought he could use as a teaching moment. "You're new here, right?" he asked. "First session," Emily said. "Welcome." He spread his hands. "Really? We're glad to have people who want to learn." He looked at the class. "That's the whole point of this, right? You come here because you're willing to admit there's something you don't know yet. That takes real courage." Some students nodded. It was a gracious-sounding setup, and Emily could hear exactly where it was going. "What's your background?" Derek asked. "Any training? Some? What kind?" "Military." Derek's eyebrows lifted just slightly. "Military. Okay, basic training, something like that." "Cool." He nodded, in the tone of someone filing a data point under not relevant. "Mostly weapons qualification, physical fitness, that kind of thing?" Emily looked at him. "Sure," she said. She watched him decide that confirmed everything he had already assumed. "Here's the thing about military fitness training," Derek said, turning back to address the whole class now, Emily becoming an object lesson rather than a person he was talking to. "It's incredibly valuable. It builds toughness, endurance, mental grit. But it's not the same as combat technique. Not close-quarter training, not the kind of thing we work on here." He paused. "Real hand-to-hand capability takes years of specialized practice. And a lot of people come in here thinking that because they've been through tough physical training, they've got a foundation for this. Sometimes they do. Sometimes," he glanced toward her with that friendly smile, "they discover they're starting at zero." The room was quiet. One student near the front stifled a smile, another actually laughed a short, small sound, quickly swallowed. Derek looked at Emily with what he clearly thought was encouragement. No offense intended. "You'll learn fast if you're willing to be a real beginner." Emily held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "None taken," and she meant it. But she also made a quiet decision right then. In the particular way she made decisions without drama, without announcement, with the simple finality of a door closing. She was going to let him show her what he meant. Derek proposed the demonstration himself. He framed it as a teaching exercise, a way of showing the class the difference between untrained movement and trained technique. He was careful with his language. He said things like no real contact and controlled environment, and absolutely no pressure. He was considerate about it, actually. He wasn't trying to humiliate her. He just didn't know what he was inviting. Emily stepped onto the mat. She stood in the center, facing him, and she let her body settle into the posture she used when she wanted to look like someone who wasn't sure what to do with their hands. Shoulders slightly forward. Weight distributed in a way that read as unbalanced to someone who knew what to look for. Her eyes tracked him with the mild attentiveness of a student watching a demonstration. Across from her, Derek settled into his stance. It was genuinely good. Clean lines. Proper weight distribution. Guard up in a position that protected his center line without telegraphing. Years and years of practice lived in that stance. She respected it. She truly did. Just going to come at you slowly, he told her. You feel what a trained approach looks like. No pressure. Okay, Emily said. He moved. What happened next lasted approximately 4 seconds. Derek came in with a controlled forward advanced textbook. Measured. The kind of approach designed to demonstrate technique rather than overwhelm. His hands were exactly where they should be. His footwork was correct. Emily didn't move until he was inside a range that most people would have considered too close. Then she moved. She didn't strike him. She didn't throw him. She did something that was harder to explain than either of those things she redirected. His advancing energy, his forward momentum, the precise mechanical sequence of his trained approach. She found the small gap inside all of it. The quarter-second window where technique becomes commitment. Where a person's body is doing exactly what they've practiced and is therefore briefly predictable, and she slipped into that gap like water finding the path through stone. His balance shifted, his feet came off the mat in a way he clearly did not intend. He went down, not hard, she controlled the descent, guided it. Actually, her hands moving with him the entire time so that he landed safely. Landed correctly, landed in a way that left him unhurt, and lying on his back, staring up at the ceiling with an expression that she had seen before. On other faces, in other rooms. The expression of someone whose understanding of the world had just been revised. The room was absolutely silent. Emily stood over him and offered her hand. He stared at it for a moment, then he took it, and she helped him to his feet. He stood there. He was breathing carefully. She could see him processing, running the 4 seconds back through his memory, trying to find the moment where it had gone wrong. The decision point, the error. She knew he wouldn't find it easily. Not because it was hidden, but because it required a frame of reference he didn't have yet. What was that, he said. It wasn't quite a question. That was you moving, Emily said. I just suggested a different direction. He looked at her. Really looked at her. For the first time since she had walked into the building, Derek Lawson looked at Emily Dawson without any assumptions layered over the looking. Who are you, he said. Before she could answer, the door at the back of the room opened. Commander Thomas Reed walked in the way men who have spent decades in positions of authority always walked in, not announcing themselves, not requiring a room to rearrange itself, but somehow causing it to anyway. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, with a particular economy of movement that comes from a lifetime of knowing exactly what his body was capable of and never needing to demonstrate it unnecessarily. He was the Academy's owner. He had founded it 12 years ago after retiring from the Navy. And the combat training programs he had built here were some of the most respected in the mid-Atlantic region. He was also, Emily knew, someone who had spent 30 years around elite military personnel, which meant he was someone who knew exactly what certain kinds of movement looked like. He had been watching through the window in the door. He stepped onto the mat. He looked at Emily, not at Derek. Not at the frozen students, not at the configuration of the room, just at Emily, with a direct, clear, uncomplicated gaze. I was hoping you'd come in, he said. Emily looked at him. You know who I am, I know what you are, Thomas said. Knew at the moment you walked in. Nobody moves through a room the way you move through this room unless they've spent a long time in environments where the wrong kind of movement gets people killed. He turned to address the class. The students, who had been perfectly still since Emily hit the mat, now seemed to collectively remember how to breathe. This is Emily Dawson, Thomas said. She's going to be a student here. She is also, he glanced at Emily, a brief, respectful glance, the kind that asks permission, and she gave the smallest nod, a combat specialist who spent 8 years working alongside Navy SEAL teams in active operational environments. The room did not just go quiet. It went the particular kind of quiet that happens when an entire group of people simultaneously realizes they have badly misread something. Derek stood very still. Close-quarter combat, Thomas continued. Emergency response. Tactical extraction. Emily has operated in environments that most people in this room, most people anywhere, will never have to imagine. She walked in here today as a student. That's what she asked to be. I want everyone in this room to understand what that means. He looked at Derek. Derek was not looking at Thomas, he was looking at Emily. And Emily could read exactly what was moving across his face, because she had seen it before that particular collision between who a person thought they were and what they had just actually done. The math of it resolving slowly, answer by answer, until the full sum sat there in front of him, and there was nowhere to look away from it. He had pointed at her in front of the entire class. He had laughed. He had made her an example. He had gotten onto the mat believing, completely and without question, that the story he had written in his head about who she was and what she was capable of was accurate. And she had let him. She had let him have all of it, the confidence, the assumption, the mild patronizing warmth, because she had learned long ago that people reveal their truest character in the moments just before they discover they were wrong. Derek had not been cruel, he had not been malicious. He had been precisely what Emily had suspected he was from the first moment she looked at him. A talented young man who had spent so long being the most skilled person in most rooms that he had confused skill with perception, who had come to believe, somewhere in the accumulated training hours and competition victories and students looking up to him, that he could look at a person and understand them. Couldn't. Nobody could. That was the lesson. Not the 4 seconds on the mat. Not the physics of what she had done to his balance. The actual lesson was the space between what he had seen when Emily walked in and what was actually standing in front of him. That space, that gap, that was what could get a person killed. The class did not resume immediately. Thomas gave them a few minutes, which most of them spent looking at Emily with expressions that ranged from astonishment to something that was still trying to figure out whether it was embarrassment on Derek's behalf or on their own. A young woman in the second row, maybe 19, wearing a blue uniform and a white belt that had clearly been tied and reteed many times in nervous practice, raised her hand. Thomas nodded at her. Did she? Could she? The young woman stopped. Tried again. She could have done more than that, right? If she'd wanted to. Thomas looked at Emily. Emily looked at the young woman. Yes, she said. The word landed simply in the room. Why didn't you? The young woman asked. Emily thought about the real answer, which was long and complicated and touched on things she had spent years and years learning and relearning. She thought about the operational environments where the application of force was precisely calibrated, where the question was never what can I do, but always what is actually required. She thought about a dozen faces she still carried with her, people she had gotten off a particular trajectory not by overpowering them but by giving them a reason to redirect. She gave the young woman the short version. Because he didn't need more than that, she said. He needed to understand something. More force wouldn't have created more understanding. It would have just created more noise. The young woman sat with that. What did he need to understand? A student near the back called out. Emily looked across the room. That the most dangerous assumption in a confrontation isn't that the other person is stronger than you, she said. It's that you already know what you're dealing with. The room was still. Derek had not moved from the center of the mat. He was still standing there, not frozen, not broken but processing. She could see it happening behind his eyes. The slow and serious work of a person who has just been handed a very large piece of information and is deciding what to do with it. He looked at her. I owe you an apology, he said. His voice was even. No performance in it, no audience management. Just the flat, honest sound of someone saying a true thing. Emily waited. I put you in front of the class as an example, Derek said. Before I knew anything about you, I decided who you were based on. He paused. Looked down briefly, looked back up based on nothing. Based on what I assumed when I looked at you. He shook his head. Once small. That was wrong, and I'm sorry. Thomas Reed watched this from the side of the room without expression. The students watched it with the attentiveness of people who understood, even if they couldn't have articulated why, that they were seeing something more important than any drill they would run today. Emily looked at Derek for a moment. She had received many apologies in her life. Some of them had been elaborate, and some of them had been brief. And she had learned to pay attention to the quality underneath the words rather than the quantity of them. She had learned that a short, clean apology from a person genuinely reckoning with something was worth 10 times more than a long, performed contrition from someone managing their image. Derek's apology was short, it was clean, and it was genuine. I know, she said. He waited, apparently expecting more. That's it, he asked. She almost smiled. An apology is the beginning of something, she said. Not the end. You apologize, that matters. What you do with the rest of the session matters more. He nodded slowly. What do you want me to do with it? Emily looked at the room. At the students who were watching with the heightened alertness of people who have realized they are inside a moment that will stay with them. Train, she said, seriously this time. Not for the room. Not for the students watching, for yourself. That's all I ask. Derek looked at her. Something shifted in his face, not a dramatic change. Not the kind of transformation that happens in stories where people become different people in an instant. Something smaller and truer than that. The particular adjustment that happens when a person decides to stop performing and start working. "Okay," he said. He walked to the edge of the mat. Took his stance. He looked at Marcus and nodded. Marcus called the class back to order, and Emily Dawson, who had come to this building wanting only to disappear into the routine of learning something new, found herself standing on a mat in Northern Virginia, thinking about the fact that she had just taught the most important lesson of the day without throwing a single deliberate strike. Thomas Reed appeared beside her. "You didn't have to let him do that," Thomas said quietly. "You could have said something before it went that far." Emily watched Derek on the mat. Technique was the same as it had been an hour ago. But something in the way he carried it had changed a degree of genuineness that hadn't been there before. Slight reduction in the performance layer. "He needed to do it," she said. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Why? Emily kept watching Derek. "Because there's only one way to really understand the mistake of underestimating someone," she said. "You have to actually do it. You have to commit to it. You have to feel the full weight of what you assumed, and then feel the full weight of being wrong." She glanced at Thomas. If I'd stopped it before it got there, he'd have gotten a story. This way, he got an experience. Thomas Reed looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, something that would stay with Emily Dawson for a long time afterward. "The teams you worked with," he said. "They were lucky." Emily looked at him. "I was the one who was lucky," she said. And she meant it exactly as much as he had meant what he'd said. He turned back to the mat. She watched Derek train. She watched a room full of people who had come in that morning believing they understood their own limits and other people's limitations, now training with something new written quietly underneath all of it. Not fear, not awe, something more useful than either. Honesty. The session had another 2 hours ahead of it. Emily picked up her water bottle, rolled her shoulders once, and walked back onto the mat. She was, after all, still here to learn. That part had always been true. Derek didn't sleep that night. He lay on his back in the dark, staring at the ceiling of his apartment, and ran the 4 seconds over and over again the way you run a song you can't get out of your head, not because you like it, but because something in it refuses to let you go. He had done everything right. That was the part he couldn't reconcile. His stance had been correct. His guard was where it was supposed to be. His forward advance was textbook. He had drilled that exact approach, somewhere between 8 and 10,000 times over the course of his training life. He had done it right. He knew he had done it right. And then somehow, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, the floor had come up to meet him, and Emily Dawson was standing over him with her hand out, and that completely calm face, like none of it had cost her anything at all. He reached for his phone on the nightstand. 2:17 in the morning. He put it back down. He thought about what she had said afterward, not the apology part. Though that sat heavy in him too, the other thing. The thing she had told the class. The most dangerous assumption in a confrontation isn't that the other person is stronger than you. It's that you already know what you're dealing with. He had been teaching that principle for 2 years. He had said versions of it in every session he led. He had believed he understood it. He hadn't understood it at all. He closed his eyes and finally, somewhere around 3 in the morning, fell into an uneasy sleep where he kept reaching for a grip that wasn't there. Emily was already on the mat when he arrived the next morning. She was alone in the training hall, 40 minutes before the session started, moving through a sequence that Derek watched from the doorway for almost a full minute before she acknowledged him. Not because she didn't know he was there. He understood that now with a clarity he hadn't possessed 24 hours ago. She knew exactly where he was. She had probably known the moment he pulled into the parking lot. She finished the sequence and turned to face him. "You're early," she said. "Couldn't sleep," he said. She nodded once, like that was the answer she expected. He walked onto the mat and stood a few feet from her. And for a moment neither of them said anything. The morning light came through the high windows. The building was completely quiet. Outside he could hear a car passing on the street. "I've been teaching for 3 years," Derek said finally. "I have a regional championship. 2 of my students went to nationals last year. I've put in," he stopped, shook his head. "I've put in more hours than I can count." "I know," Emily said. "And it didn't matter." "It mattered," she said, "just not in the way you expected it to." He looked at her. "What does that mean?" Emily picked up her water bottle. He took a drink, set it back down, and looked at him with that direct, uncomplicated gaze that he was already beginning to recognize as simply the way she looked at things. No performance in it, no softening, no armor, just attention. "Your training gave you real capability," she said. "What it didn't give you was an accurate map of other people's capability. Those are two completely different things. A lot of very skilled people never figure that out. Derek was quiet. How do you figure it out, he asked. The hard way, Emily said. Usually, he almost smiled. It didn't quite make it to his face. Yesterday was the hard way. Yesterday was the easy version, she said. That landed on him differently than she might have intended. Or maybe exactly as she intended, he was still calibrating how much she intended. He looked at her. What's the hard version? Emily looked at him for a moment. Getting it wrong when it counts, she said quietly. When someone's life is on the line, yours or someone else's. That's the hard version. Yesterday was a training room with rubber mats and 30 students watching. Nobody got hurt. Nobody was in danger. You got knocked down and got back up, and the only thing that was damaged was your assumption. She paused. That's not the hard version. That's a gift. Derek stood with that. Something in the room shifted, not dramatically but genuinely. The particular shift that happens when a person stops defending their position and starts actually receiving information. Can I ask you something, he said. Go ahead, what was it? The 4 seconds. What did you actually do? Emily looked at him steadily. What do you think I did? I've been running it back all night, he said. I can't find it. I know my approach was right. I know my guard was up. But somewhere in there he stopped, frustrated. You found something. I don't know what. I found the moment your technique became a commitment, Emily said. When you're executing something you've drilled that many times, your body knows exactly what comes next. That's the strength of good training. It makes you fast and automatic and reliable. It's also a window because for just a fraction of a second, before you can adapt, you're doing the thing you practiced and nothing else. Derek went very still. I used to watch for that in the field, Emily said. It's not the motion that matters, it's the instant right before the motion completes. That's where there's space. He was quiet for a long moment. You saw that in 4 seconds less, she said. How long did it take you to learn that? Emily looked toward the windows. Outside, another car passed. 8 years in environments where missing it wasn't an option, she said. And everything that happened before that. Derek nodded slowly. Not the nod of someone wrapping up a conversation. The nod of someone just beginning to understand how much he didn't know. The morning session filled up fast. Word had traveled as word always traveled in a facility like this one. Fast and imprecise, and loaded with the particular electricity of a story that people couldn't quite believe until they heard it from someone who'd been in the room. By 7 o'clock, there were 8 students who hadn't been there the previous day. Derek recognized faces from the afternoon programs, from the advanced class, from the competition team that usually trained separately. They weren't there for the drills, they were there to see Emily Dawson. Emily noticed them the moment she walked back onto the mat at 5 to 7. She noticed the cluster near the far wall, the way the room's energy was different from yesterday, tighter, more charged, pointed in a direction. She noticed the 2 students who were holding phones slightly awkwardly, the way people held phones when they were trying to look like they weren't filming. She didn't say anything about the phones. She picked up her bag, pulled out her hand wraps, and started wrapping her hands the way she always did, left first. 3 passes around the wrist, 2 through the thumb, slow and careful. She had wrapped her hands thousands of times. She could do it unconscious. But she always did it carefully. Because careless habits in small things had a way of becoming careless habits in large things. Marcus called the class to order. The session began. And for the first 30 minutes, nothing remarkable happened. Emily drilled. She followed Marcus's instruction. She was slightly slower than she needed to be on some of the combinations, slightly faster on others, not performing incompetence. Just being genuinely present in the learning process, which meant being actually slower on the things that were new to her particular training background, and actually faster on the things that weren't. She could feel the room watching her. Every time she executed a technique, she could feel the students recalibrating their observations against what they'd heard about the previous day. Some of them looked impressed. Some of them looked uncertain. A few looked openly skeptical, the particular skepticism of young athletes who hadn't been in the room yesterday and were now trying to decide how much of the story to believe. One of those was a young man named Carter. Carter was 23 years old, built like someone who had spent the last 5 years making sure everyone understood he was built that way, with a confidence that radiated off him in waves and a habit of positioning himself at the center of any competitive situation in the room. He was talented, genuinely talented, maybe the 2nd or 3rd best student in the facility, and he carried his talent the way Derek used to carry his, which was visibly and constantly, so that nobody would ever have the option of not noticing it. He had not been in the room yesterday. He had heard the story 3 different times from 3 different people before he walked in this morning, and each time he heard it, he had made the same quiet adjustment, discounting. Not consciously. Not maliciously. Just the automatic recalibration of a competitive person who hears a story about someone being impressive and measures it against their own internal standard and finds ways, small and reasonable-sounding ways, to reduce the distance between that standard and the story. He got lucky. Derek wasn't really trying. The story got exaggerated in the retelling. He watched Emily during the drills. She was good. He could see that. But she wasn't, and he turned this over carefully in his mind. Looking for the honest version of it, she wasn't what the story implied. She was controlled, she was precise, she had clearly trained seriously at some point. But the story he'd heard suggested something almost superhuman. And what he was watching was a woman in her late 30s, moving through drills, with the composure of someone experienced but not. He decided exceptional. He waited until the open sparring segment. Then he walked over. "I heard about yesterday," he said, planting himself in front of Emily with the casual authority of someone who considers every space they enter to be theirs. "That's pretty wild." "Derek's good, he is," Emily agreed. "I'm Carter, Emily, I know." He smiled the particular smile of someone who has decided they're being friendly rather than examining whether they actually are. "I just want to say, no disrespect, but Derek can be a little," he searched for the word theatrical, "in the way he trains. I'm not saying what happened wasn't real. I just think it might have been a little more controlled situations than people are making it out to be." Emily looked at him. "Is that right?" she said. "I'm not trying to be a jerk about it," Carter said. "I just think it's worth having an accurate picture. You know?" "I appreciate that," Emily said. He waited for something more. She didn't give him anything more. The waiting made him slightly uncomfortable, and the slight discomfort made him push forward. "You want to run around?" he asked. "Just to, I don't know. See where you're at, no pressure." Emily looked at him for a moment. She thought about what she had told Derek the night before, or rather, that morning. The answer she had given when he asked how you learn to read the gap in someone's approach. The hard way, usually. She thought about the phones against the far wall. She thought about Carter's particular brand of confidence, which was different from Derek's. Derek's had been social, performative, a dominance display in front of his students. Carter's was something more internal, more settled, rooted in a genuine belief in his own capability that had simply never been tested against a wide enough range of opposition. She thought about what the session needed. She thought about what Carter needed. "Sure," she said. They squared off in the center of the mat. Marcus had stopped the general session to watch less because he was facilitating, and more because he had been in the room yesterday, and he recognized the particular quality of attention that had descended over the space. Every student in the room had stopped moving. The students near the wall who hadn't been there yesterday watched with open curiosity. The ones who had been there yesterday watched with the particular expression of people who know something is coming and aren't sure whether to warn someone or just let it arrive. Derek stood near the edge of the mat. His arms were crossed. Face was complicated. Carter settled into his stance. It was powerful, wide base, high guard, the stance of a fighter who was very comfortable with pressure, liked to engage and push forward and use his size and strength to establish terms. He was significantly larger than Emily, not just taller, but broader, denser. The physical advantage obvious enough that two of the students near the wall exchanged a look. Emily stood across from him. She did the things she had done yesterday, nothing. Just stood there, relaxed, weight easy, hands in a position that was technically a guard but looked almost casual, way a person might hold their hands while waiting for a bus. "Whenever you're ready," Carter said. She waited. He waited. The room breathed. Then Carter moved. He moved well. He moved with the confidence of someone who had thrown these combinations thousands of times and felt the way they landed and knew what good movement felt like from the inside. He pushed forward with real intent, not the controlled, demonstrative approach Derek had used yesterday. Carter was actually trying. And for 6 full seconds, Emily let him work. She moved backward. He slipped angles. She let him feel like he was crowding her, building pressure, establishing the terms of the engagement. He could feel the room's tension ratcheting up, could feel the students reading this as trouble, as the older woman getting pushed around by someone bigger and more aggressive. She let it build. She let Carter feel it too, the growing confidence that the story had been exaggerated, that Derek had pulled his approach, that this was going the way he'd known it would go when he walked over and asked. She let him commit to that story, and then she stopped going backward. It happened in less than 2 seconds. She stopped retreating, found an angle that Carter hadn't covered because he was fully invested in the forward pressure he'd been building, and redirected his momentum with a precision that was almost surgical, using the exact force he was putting into the room and simply changing its address. Carter's own drive forward became the mechanism of his undoing. He went sideways and down in a controlled sequence that she managed every millimeter of, landing him safely on the mat for the second time that morning. Flat on his back, staring at the ceiling, the room erupted. Not applause, something rawer than that. A collective exhale that had sound in it. Someone said "oh" out loud without finishing the thought. One of the students near the phone stopped pretending not to film. Carter lay there for a moment. Then he said, loudly enough for the whole room to hear, "What in the how?" Emily offered her hand. He took it. He stood up and looked at her with an expression that was completely different from the one he'd walked over with. The confidence was still there, but it had been restructured. Reorganized around a much more accurate set of facts. "Okay," he said. "Okay, that's..." He stopped, looked at the room, looked back at her. "Can you show me what you did?" And that was the moment Emily Dawson stopped being the person everyone was watching and started being the person everyone was listening to. She spent 20 minutes breaking it down. Not the physical mechanics alone, though she covered those. Walking Carter through the geometry of what she had used, the angle, the timing, the precise point at which his forward momentum had become a liability rather than an asset. She covered the mechanical reality of it carefully and clearly, with the precision of someone who understood the physics from the inside out. But she also talked about the other layer. "Before I touched you," she told Carter, "and the room was absolutely silent, I watched you for 6 seconds. 6 seconds of you moving the way you trained to move. And in that time I learned more about your approach than most opponents would learn in 60 seconds of actual exchange. Because you were doing exactly what you're trained to do. You were executing. And execution is information." Carter looked at her. "So the whole thing, the 6 seconds of you backing up reading," Emily said. "I wasn't backing up, I was reading." He processed that. "You knew what you were going to do before you did it." "I knew what was available," she corrected. "There's a difference. I don't plan in advance, I stay available. When the opening appears, I move. If you plan, you stop watching. And the moment you stop watching, the opponent adjusts and your plan is obsolete." A student near the back, the same young woman who had asked the question yesterday, the one in the blue uniform, raised her hand. "Is that something you can learn?" she asked. "Or is it just something some people have?" Emily looked at her. "What's your name?" "Priya." "How long have you been training?" "Priya?" 8 months. Emily nodded. "Do you remember your first week? When every technique felt like something you had to think through consciously. Step by step." Priya nodded. And now Priya thought about it. "Some of them are, they're just there. I don't think about them the same way." "That's the beginning of it," Emily said. "That's the first layer. The technique moves from conscious to automatic. Once that happens, part of your attention is freed up. Instead of spending all of it on what your own body is doing, you can spend some of it on what the other person is doing." She looked around the room. "That's what's available to all of you. It's not a gift. It's a destination. You train the basics until they're automatic, and then you start actually seeing." The room held that. Thomas Reed was standing by the door again. Emily hadn't seen him come in, but she wasn't surprised that he was there. She had noticed, over the course of the morning, that he had a pattern. He moved through the facility quietly, appeared in doorways, watched for periods of time, disappeared again. The monitoring of someone who cared deeply about what was happening in his building and trusted his people enough not to intervene unless intervention was needed. He caught her eye briefly. He nodded once. She understood that too. After the session, Derek found her by the equipment lockers. He was still carrying the expression he'd worn since Carter went down, something thoughtful and slightly unsettled. The look of a person working through a problem that kept opening into new problems. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You asked me that this morning. Different question." Emily waited. "Yesterday, when I pointed you out in front of the class," he stopped, chose his words carefully. "You knew what was going to happen, didn't you? You knew before I even asked you onto the mat." Emily looked at him. "Yes," she said. "Something moved across his face, and you let it happen anyway." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Why, you could have said something. You could have stopped it before it got to the mat. You could have." He searched. "I don't know. Mentioned something about your background. Given me a reason to recalibrate." "I could have," Emily agreed. "So, why didn't you?" She leaned against the locker and looked at him. "Because a correction handed to you isn't the same as a correction earned by you. If I'd said, 'Hey, actually I have 8 years of SEAL team experience,' you would have recalibrated intellectually. You would have adjusted your behavior. But here we are 24 hours later, and you stayed late this morning to ask me questions. You watched what happened with Carter, and you were thinking the whole time. You're standing here right now having a genuine conversation instead of managing your image in front of me." She looked at him steadily. "That's not the behavior of someone who received a piece of information. That's the behavior of someone who had an experience." Derek was silent. I needed to do it the way I did it, she continued. Because you needed to feel the full weight of the assumption. Not hear about it, feel it. He absorbed that's he started. Uncomfortable, she finished for him. I know, I'm sorry for the uncomfortable part. I'm not sorry for the rest, he looked at her. Did anyone ever do that to you? Let you walk into it so you'd learn? Emily's expression shifted not much. Not dramatically, but enough that Derek noticed it. Something behind her eyes that had the quality of memory. Yes, she said. He waited. She didn't add anything to it. He understood after a moment that the story behind that yes was not one she was going to share with someone she'd known for 24 hours. Maybe not with anyone. He understood that some experiences belonged entirely to the person who had them, and the weight was part of what made them formative. He nodded. Okay, he said, thank you. For he gestured vaguely at the mat. The morning, the whole complicated territory of the last 2 days for this. Keep asking questions, Emily said. That's all I want. She picked up her bag. She walked toward the exit. She was almost at the door when Derek called after her. Emily, she stopped. There are students here who need what you're teaching, he said. Not the technique. He looked for it, the other thing. The seeing thing. Emily looked back at him. She didn't answer immediately. She stood in the doorway, and Derek had the sense that she was turning something over privately. The way you turn something over when it matters, and you want to be careful with it, she finally said. And then she was gone. Thomas Reed called her that evening. She was at her kitchen table eating leftover pasta and looking at nothing in particular when her phone rang. He looked at the screen, didn't recognize the number for a moment, then placed the prefix, the area code she associated with the facility. He answered. This is Thomas Reed, I know, she said. I saw you in the doorway this morning. I know you saw me. A brief pause. She could hear the smile in it, without any warmth being manufactured. Just the real kind. I wanted to ask you something. Go ahead. How long are you planning to be in the area? Emily looked at her pasta. I'm not planning much of anything right now. That's the whole point. Fair enough. Thomas paused again. I want to offer you something. And I want you to take your time with it, rather than answering right now. Emily put her fork down. What is it? I've been talking to the Veterans Outreach Network for 3 months, Thomas said. They want to develop a training program for former service members transitioning to civilian life. Not physical training exclusively, more than that. Emotional regulation, reading environments, managing the specific ways that military experience can misalign with civilian contexts. He paused. They need someone who can bridge that, who understands both worlds from the inside. The kitchen was quiet. I'm not a counselor, Emily said. I know what you are, Thomas said. I've known since you walked in that door. She looked at the wall. I need to think about it, she said. I know, Thomas said. Take the time you need. After she hung up, Emily sat for a long time without moving. She thought about the question Derek had asked her. Did anyone ever do that to you? Let you walk into it so you'd learn? Yes, she had said. What she hadn't said was that the person who had done it was a commanding officer who had seen something in her early in her career that she hadn't fully seen in herself, who had put her in a situation that exceeded what she thought she was capable of, not to break her, not to prove a point, but because he understood with the precision of someone who had spent decades developing people that the gap between who she was and who she could become could only be closed by experience. She had been furious with him for about 48 hours, and then she had understood. And everything that came after had been built on the foundation of that understanding. She picked up her fork. She finished her pasta. She did not make a decision, but she stopped running from the question. And for Emily Dawson, who had spent years running from questions about her past, who had learned that the only safe distance from what she'd been through was the distance of silence, stopping the run was not a small thing. It was the beginning of something she couldn't yet name, but it was real. And she had learned in all those years of training and operation and careful, costly experience that real was the only thing worth building on. She called Thomas back the next morning, not because she had made a decision, because she had spent the night doing the thing she always did when something mattered, turning it over slowly, examining it from every angle, looking for the hidden weight in it, the thing underneath the surface thing that would only reveal itself once she committed and couldn't go back. She had done this before every major decision of her adult life, before she enlisted, before she volunteered for the advanced program, before she accepted the assignment that took her out of conventional support roles and into the operational environments that defined the next 6 years of her existence. She had always found the hidden weight, and she had always gone anyway. I have questions, she said when Thomas picked up. Good, he said. People without questions make bad program directors. She caught the word. I haven't agreed to anything. No, Thomas said. You called me back in less than 12 hours. That's not someone saying no. She didn't argue with that because it was accurate. Tell me about the veterans, she said, specifically. Not the program. The people it's for. Thomas was quiet for a moment, the quiet of someone organizing information rather than buying time. Former service members. Mostly Army and Marine, Navy, few Air Force. All combat-adjacent experience, all struggling with the same cluster of problems: hypervigilance in civilian environments, difficulty reading social situations that don't have clear operational structure, anger management, isolation, the classic transition profile, but more acute than average. How acute? 2 of them lost jobs in the last 6 months. 1 lost a marriage. 3 are in various stages of legal trouble, nothing violent. Mostly judgment calls that went wrong in situations where their combat instincts fired in contexts that didn't call for them. Emily was quiet. One of them, Thomas continued, and his voice shifted slightly. 27 years old. 3 tours, came home with every physical part intact. And he is completely unable to hold a conversation with a stranger without it escalating. Not because he wants it to escalate. Because he has spent so many years in environments where a stranger who surprised him could kill him that his body doesn't know how to downgrade the threat assessment. The wiring runs too deep. Emily said nothing. You know that experience, Thomas said. Not a question, I know it, she said. Then you know what it costs someone to live in a civilian world with that wiring and no one around them who understands what they're actually dealing with. She knew. She knew because she had spent 3 years after leaving the service navigating exactly that landscape, the particular loneliness of being in a room full of people and understanding, with complete clarity that none of them had any framework for who she actually was. Not her family. Not the well-meaning therapist who kept using words that were technically accurate but felt like they'd been translated from a language she didn't speak. Not the people she dated who were kind and patient until they weren't, until the night she woke up at 3 a.m. and cleared the apartment room by room without fully understanding she was doing it, and then stood in the kitchen with her heart hammering and thought, I cannot explain this to anyone who needs me to explain it from the beginning. What do you need from me? She asked. Show up, Thomas said. That's it. Show up and talk to them, not as a program, not with a curriculum. Just be someone they can recognize. Someone who's been where they are and found a way through it. I'm still finding my way through it. I know, Thomas said. That's exactly why it should be you. The first meeting with the veterans group was on a Thursday evening in a room at the back of the academy. Thomas had arranged it 6 folding chairs in a rough circle. Table with coffee and water, nothing else, no agenda posted. No title on the door. Just 6 people and Emily and a Thursday evening, and the particular quality of silence that fills a room when everyone present is accustomed to reading silence for threat, and there isn't any threat, and nobody quite knows what to do with that. Emily arrived first and chose the chair that put her back to the wall and a clear sight line to the door. She did it without thinking about it. She noticed she'd done it afterward and thought about moving. She didn't move. They arrived in 1s and 2s over the next 10 minutes. Marcus came first, not the Marcus from the academy. A different one. A former Army Ranger named Marcus Tate, who was 34 years old and built like a man who had spent a decade doing things that required him to be built that way. He came in, clocked the room in 2 seconds the way every person in that room would clock it. Identified the exit, identified the coffee, and sat down without speaking. Then a woman named Sonia, former Marine Corps logistics sergeant, late 20s, with a weariness around her eyes that had nothing to do with being tired and everything to do with being exhausted by vigilance. He nodded at Emily. Emily nodded back. Something passed between them that didn't need words. Then 3 men in quick succession, James Ray, and a former Air Force loadmaster named Pete, who walked with a slight hitch in his left knee that he clearly worked hard not to favor. Then the last one. The 27-year-old Thomas had told her about. His name was Danny Kowalski. He walked in like someone moving through a space that was probably safe, but he decided to treat it as probably not safe. Because that was the hedge that kept you alive, and old habits were old habits, and anyway the math was the math. He had the kind of face that was probably pleasant when it was at rest, and was currently not at rest. He chose the chair that was as far from Emily as the small circle permitted, sat with his weight slightly forward, and looked at her with the frank, measuring look of someone who has no patience for anything that isn't going to be useful to him. You're the SEAL person, he said. SEAL support, Emily said. Not SEAL close enough. He looked around the room. What are we doing here? I'm not entirely sure, Emily said. That surprised him. She could see it, the fractional reset of his expression, the adjustment that happens when the expected answer doesn't arrive, and the brain scrambles briefly to recalibrate. Thomas said you were going to run a program. Thomas is optimistic, Emily said. Tonight I thought we'd just talk. Danny looked at her steadily. About what? About whatever's actually going on with you. The room went very quiet. Not the threatening kind of quiet, the kind where people are genuinely listening because the person speaking has just said something real. What makes you think something's going on with me? Danny said. Emily looked at him. You chose the chair with the most distance from the door. You've looked at it twice since you sat down. Your left hand has been on your knee the whole time, and every 30 seconds you press down slightly pressure response probably doesn't even feel voluntary anymore. And you've been managing your breathing since you walked in, which means the room felt more threatening than you expected and you're compensating. The silence changed quality. Danny stared at her. Then slowly he looked down at his left hand on his knee. He lifted it, set it on the armrest, looked back up at her. My therapist doesn't do that, he said. Do what? See me. Emily didn't respond to that right away. She let it sit in the room where it belonged, because it deserved to be heard without immediately being answered. Marcus, who had been completely still since he sat down, said without looking up from the floor, mine either. Sonia said, mine tries. She's just working with a map of somewhere she's never been. And just like that, without agenda or curriculum or program structure, room started talking. It went for 2 hours. Not smoothly, not linearly. The way real conversations go when the people having them have spent years not having them in lurches and stops, with long silences that weren't empty but were full of people deciding how much to risk, followed by sudden rushes of honesty that surprised even the person producing them. James talked about losing the job at the security firm, not the official version, the version where he'd failed to follow protocol, but the real version, where a situation had escalated in a parking garage and his body had responded to a loud noise, and a man moving fast in the way his body had been trained to respond to a loud noise, and a man moving fast, and by the time his conscious mind had re-engaged, the situation was already past the point where explanations mattered. Ray talked about his daughter. That part of the conversation went quietly, in short sentences with long pauses between them. His daughter was 9. She was afraid of him. Not because he had done anything to her, never. Not once, not a raised hand or a raised voice at her specifically. But because he was a presence in the house that she had learned to read as volatile. A pressure system she monitored the way children monitor pressure systems when they grow up around them. And he knew she did it, and he couldn't figure out how to stop being the thing she was monitoring. I watch her, watch me, Ray said. And I don't know how to tell her that I'm not, that I would never. He stopped. His jaw worked. She's 9. How do you explain operational trauma response to a 9-year-old? You don't explain it to her, Emily said. Not yet, he looked at her. You show her something different. One instance at a time. You let her accumulate evidence that contradicts the pattern she's learned. You can't argue her out of the fear. Fear doesn't respond to argument. Responds to repeated, consistent evidence of safety. Ray looked at her for a long moment. Is that what you did, he asked, in your life after? Emily held his gaze. I'm still doing it, she said. The honesty of that landed in the room like something physical. Danny, who had said nothing since his opening exchange with Emily, who had sat with his arms crossed and his face careful for the better part of an hour, suddenly said, how long does it take? Everyone looked at him. The recalibrating, he said, the teaching yourself that the threat level isn't what your body thinks it is. How long before it actually changes? Before it's not just management. It's actually different? Emily was quiet for a moment. I'm not going to give you a number, she said, because the honest answer is that it's different for everyone, and I don't know yours. What I can tell you is that it does change. Not because the experience goes away, but because you build enough new experience on top of it that the old wiring stops being the only wiring. Give your nervous system more data. Better data. And slowly, she paused slowly, the threat calculation updates. Danny looked at her with an expression that was complicated in ways she recognized hope and skepticism running in parallel, neither one willing to concede to the other. You believe that, he said. Or is that the thing you're supposed to say? Danny, Emily said. And her voice was level and clean and held nothing but the plain truth. I was cleared to say nothing this evening. There's no script. I'm telling you what I have actually experienced. He held her gaze. Then something in him, not everything, not the whole defensive architecture, but some small structural component of it quietly released. He uncrossed his arms. He sat back in the chair. It was a small thing. It was everything. Thomas was waiting for her when she came out. He was in the hallway, leaning against the wall with a paper cup of coffee that had probably been cold for an hour, and he looked at her with the expression of someone who had been listening through the door and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. How'd it feel, he asked. Like something I should have done 3 years ago, Emily said. You weren't ready 3 years ago. How do you know? Because 3 years ago you would have run a program, Thomas said. Tonight you had a conversation. Those are not the same thing. Emily looked at him. The door's thin, he said, without apology. He handed her the cold coffee. She took, I want to ask you something, and I want you to hear it as a genuine question and not a negotiation. Go ahead. What would it take for you to make this permanent? Not a one-time pilot program. You here, working with these people long-term. Emily looked at the cold coffee in her hand. Permanent is a large word. It's the right word for what the people in that room need, Thomas said. They don't need a workshop. They need someone who's not going anywhere. Someone who will be there next Thursday, and the Thursday after that, and the Thursday after that. Until the Thursday when Danny Kowalski walks in and sits in a chair without calculating exits first. He looked at her. That takes time. It takes consistency. It takes someone who means it. Emily was quiet for a long moment. She thought about the first time she had sat in a room like the one she'd just left, in the weeks after she transitioned out, in a support group that was theoretically designed for exactly what she needed, and practically filled with people who looked at her story with the particular expression of people who understand the words, but not the weight. She had stopped going after 3 sessions. She had spent the following 2 years figuring it out alone, which was slower and harder and lonelier than it needed to be. And she had managed it because she had the particular combination of stubbornness and self-sufficiency that the work had built into her bone deep. But she had also understood quietly and without discussing it with anyone that she had been lucky, that some people didn't have her particular brand of stubbornness, and without someone to recognize what they were actually dealing with, they found other solutions, worse solutions, solutions that weren't solutions at all. Tell me about Derek, she said. Thomas looked slightly surprised by the redirect. What about him, his program, the students he trains? What's his long-term trajectory here? Thomas studied her. He's good. He's going to be very good. If he keeps growing the way he started growing 2 days ago, he could run his own division within a few years. He changed, Emily said. In 2 sessions. Genuinely changed the way he sees the room, the way he sees the students, not completely, not permanently yet. But he started. Yes, Thomas said. That happened because something real occurred, Emily said. Not a lecture, not a training module. A real experience with real stakes and a real person who didn't let him off easy. She looked at Thomas. Your students need the same thing the veterans need. They need someone to close the gap between the version of themselves they're performing and the version they're actually capable of becoming. Technique is secondary. The seeing is primary. Thomas looked at her carefully. Are you talking about working with both groups, he said. The veterans and the students? Emily set the cold coffee down on the hallway table. I'm talking about not making the distinction, she said. The hallway was very quiet. Thomas Reed looked at the woman across from him who had walked into his building 3 days ago as a beginner and was now telling him something that he understood with the certainty of 30 years of developing people. The best idea he had heard in a long time. Explain, he said. The veterans need to rebuild their ability to read civilian environments without the threat overlay, Emily said. The students need to learn to read people, not techniques. People with accuracy and without assumption. Those 2 problems are not different problems. They're the same problem from opposite ends. She looked at him. Put them in the room together, carefully, with structure. Let them teach each other what they can't teach themselves. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said Derek is going to resist it initially. I know, Carter definitely will. Good, Emily said. Carter's resistance will teach him more than his compliance. Thomas looked at her for another long moment. You've thought about this more than one night, he said. Emily picked up the cold coffee again. I've thought about this for 3 years. I just didn't know what I was thinking about it for. She told Derek the next morning. He was there early again. She was beginning to understand that early arrival was how he processed things. The same way she sat in parking lots, and he showed up before anyone else, and worked through whatever was sitting in him by moving. She respected that. She laid out the broad structure of what she had discussed with Thomas. The joint sessions, the combined group, the specific intention of pairing veteran experience with student experience in a way that served both. Derek listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, you want to bring combat veterans into training sessions with my students. Alongside your students, Emily said. There's a difference. What if it goes wrong, he said. Define wrong. What if someone has an episode? What if one of the veterans, I'm not saying this to be dismissive, I just want to understand the risk. What if someone reacts in a way that scares the students? Emily looked at him. We deal with it. Carefully, honestly, and in a way that teaches both groups something real about human beings under pressure. He absorbed that. You're going to use the hard moments, he said. Not an accusation. Recognition, actually. Yes, Emily said. The same way you were used, the same way I was used. The same way every person in that room last night has been used by their hardest experiences, except in this case, intentionally, with support, with a framework, with someone in the room who has been through it. Derek looked at the mat. He looked back at her. 2 days ago, I thought I had nothing to learn from you, he said. I know, I was completely wrong, I know that too. He half smiled the first time she had seen him smile without any performance in it. Just a genuine, rueful, slightly odd expression that she found much more convincing than all the previous confident ones. Okay, he said, I'm in. What do you need from me? Your students' trust, she said. Which means they need yours. So what I need first, for you to be in the room and mean it, not observe. Participate. He nodded. Done. And I need you to know that some of what happens in those sessions is going to be uncomfortable for you. Not because I'm targeting you, but because you're going to be in a room with people who have a completely different relationship to discomfort than what you've encountered before, and your instinct will be to manage that. And don't, Emily said. Just stay in it. Let it be uncomfortable. Let the discomfort teach you, he held her gaze. You're very good at this, he said. I had very good teachers, she said. And I paid very close attention to them. Even when paying attention hurt, the thing she hadn't anticipated was Carter. She had expected Carter to be resistant to the joint program. Thomas had predicted it. She had predicted it. She had already thought through the approach she'd use to bring him along when he pushed back. She had mentally prepared for the version of Carter who had sat across from her on the mat, certain, skeptical, testing. What she had not prepared for was Carter appearing at the door of the back room on Thursday evening while the veterans group was still in session. She heard him before she saw him footsteps in the corridor. Then a pause. Then the particular sound of someone deciding whether to knock. She was in the middle of a conversation with Danny when she heard it, and she filed it without breaking her attention, and then the knock came. Come in, she said. Carter opened the door. He looked at the room's 6 veterans. Folding chairs, no agenda, Emily in the chair with her back to the wall. He read it in about 2 seconds, and then his face did something she hadn't expected. It went uncertain, not nervous, not scared. Uncertain, the expression of someone who has walked into something real and has discovered, instantaneously, that they have no performance calibrated for it. I thought. He stopped. You thought what? Emily said. Thomas said the program was starting tonight. I wanted to. He stopped again. He looked around the room at the veterans, who were looking at him with the particular patience of people who have sat in enough rooms to know when someone is finding their footing. I don't know why I'm here, actually. Yes, you do, Emily said. He looked at her. Why? She asked. Simple, no pressure. Carter stood in the doorway for a moment. Because of what you said the other day, he said finally. About training until the technique is automatic, and then your attention frees up, and then you can start actually seeing. He paused. I've been training for 5 years. And I've been so focused on being better than the person across from me that I think I missed. He stopped. I think I missed the whole point. The room was very quiet. Danny Kowalski, who had said very little in the last hour, looked at Carter with an expression that was complicated and human and genuinely interested. How old are you? Danny asked. Carter looked at him. 23. Danny looked at Emily. He's younger than me, he said. And he already knows something I'm still figuring out. The 2 young men looked at each other, the academy fighter and the combat veteran. 23 and 27, from completely different worlds, in the same room, both of them in the same particular territory of beginning to understand something that had eluded them before. Emily watched it happen. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. She looked at the circle of chairs. Pull one up, she told Carter. He sat down. The session continued, and Emily Dawson, who had walked into this building 4 days ago wanting only to be invisible, sat in a room that was now full of people who were beginning to see each other clearly, and understood that this, not the 4 seconds on the mat, not the revelation, not the apology, this was what she had been working toward without knowing it. This room, these people, this particular quality of honesty that only emerges when someone who has been through the worst of things sits down with people who are navigating their own version of difficult and says, without performance, without armor, without any agenda except the truth, I know what you're carrying. I know because I carried it. And I'm still here. That was the thing Thomas had understood when he watched her walk through his door. That was the thing she was only now, 4 days later, beginning to understand about herself. She was not here to be a student. She was not here to hide. She was here because the only thing she had ever been trained to do, truly trained, at the deepest level, was to find the gap between what was and what could be, and move into it. She had spent 8 years doing it in the field. She had spent the last 3 doing it alone, and now, in a room with a folding chair and cold coffee and 7 people who had all arrived with something to prove and nothing to lose, she was doing it again. The difference was that this time, she wasn't doing it for anyone else. She was doing it because it was who she was. And, for the first time since she had left the Navy, that felt like something she didn't need to hide. The joint sessions started the following Tuesday. Thomas had given Emily full authority over the structure, which she used carefully and minimally, because she had learned that overstructuring a room was just another form of control, and control was the thing these people needed least. What they needed was contact. Real, unmanaged, uncomfortable contact with human beings who were different from them in ways that mattered. She put the veterans and the students together without preamble. Veterans, 8 students, 1 mat, 2 hours. Derek stood at the edge of the mat with his arms at his sides not crossed, she noticed, which meant he was remembering what she had asked of him. Participate, not observe. He was trying. She could see the effort in the deliberate openness of his posture. Carter was already on the mat. He had arrived 10 minutes early and positioned himself next to Marcus Tate without anyone suggesting it, with the particular instinct of a competitive young man who has decided that the most useful thing he can do is get close to the most formidable person in the room and figure out what that person knows. Marcus had looked at him sideways when he sat down. Said nothing, let him stay, that was already something. Emily looked at the room. Here's what we're not doing today, she said. We're not running drills. We're not sparring. We're not evaluating anyone's technique. One of the academy students, a 19-year-old named Jesse, who had been training since he was 12 and wore that history in the way he occupied space, looked up. Then what are we doing? Talking, Emily said. Jesse looked at Derek with an expression that said he wasn't sure this was what he'd signed up for. Derek looked back at him with an expression that said, I know, stay anyway. Jesse stayed. Here's the problem I want to start with, Emily said. Every person in this room, veterans and students alike, has trained themselves to operate under pressure. You've all built responses, patterns, automatic reactions that activate when a situation escalates. The question I want us to spend time on today is this. What happens when those responses fire in the wrong context? She let it land. Then Danny Kowalski said from across the room, you end up in a parking garage at 11 at night with your hand around a stranger's collar because he dropped his keys too loud. The room went completely still. James looked at the floor. Because it was his parking garage. Stranger, his story. He hadn't expected Danny to say it. He looked up, jaw tight. Danny looked back at him. Teddy. I'm not putting you out there, man. I'm saying it happens to all of us. Mine was a grocery store. Somebody bumped my cart and I had him against the dairy case before I even decided to move. The students were very quiet. Carter was watching Danny with the total unguarded attention of someone who has just understood that the room he walked into is much more serious than he anticipated. Did he get hurt? Carter asked Danny. Danny looked at him. No, because his wife screamed and it broke through. But it was close. He paused. That's not a story I tell people. Why are you telling it now? Jesse asked. Danny looked at Emily. Because she's not going to let us leave here with the comfortable version, he said. Emily didn't confirm or deny it. She just let the room decide what to do with that. What the room did was open. It happened gradually. Then, all at once, the way rooms open when someone has gone first with the true thing and given everyone else permission to follow. James talked about the parking garage without the official framing. Anya talked about her first civilian job interview, where she had sat across a desk from a hiring manager who kept touching his face and adjusting things on his desk, and she had spent the entire interview reading him as a threat assessment rather than a human being who was nervous, and had left the interview certain she hadn't gotten the job without understanding that the nervousness was his, not hers. She hadn't gotten the job. She had applied to 43 jobs over 2 years before she got one she kept. Priya, the student in the blue uniform who had been asking questions since the first morning, was listening to Sonia with the particular attention of someone who is hearing something that is reorganizing their understanding of the world. But you knew, she said. You knew you were reading it wrong. While it was happening? Knowing and stopping are different things, Sonia said. Knowing is the first layer. Stopping takes a different kind of practice. The knowing doesn't automatically translate to the stopping. Priya looked at Emily. That's what she's been teaching us, Priya said, right? In the regular sessions. The thing about attention being freed up once the technique is automatic. Talking about building the second layer. Yes, Emily said. Oh, the stopping becomes trainable. Everything becomes trainable, Emily said. Given the right conditions, the right practice, and the right amount of time. She looked around the room. That's why you're all in this room together. Because the veterans are working on the stopping, and the students are working on the seeing. And both of those things require the same fundamental skill. Which is? Derek asked. He was no longer at the edge of the room. He had moved, some point in the last 30 minutes, to a chair inside the circle. Emily noted it without remarking on it. Accurate perception under pressure, Emily said. Seeing what's actually in front of you, not what you're training. Your fear, your assumption, or your history tells you is in front of you. What is actually objectively really there? She looked at Danny. What was actually in front of you in the grocery store? She asked. Danny looked at her steadily. He didn't flinch from the directness of it. A guy with a cart who wasn't paying attention. And what did your system tell you was in front of you? A pause. A threat, right? Emily said. Your system processed an abrupt physical contact in a confined space and produced a threat response that was accurate to its training environment and completely inaccurate to its actual environment. The system wasn't broken. It was doing exactly what you built it to do. The problem was a mismatch between the conditions it was built for and the conditions it was operating in. She looked at the students. And your version of this, she told them, is subtler, but it's the same architecture. You walk into a sparring session and your system tells you who the threat is, what level of capability they have, whether they're worth your full attention based on age, size, posture, gender, how they move when they think no one is watching. Your system produces a picture, and you act on the picture instead of on the person. She didn't look at Derek when she said it. She didn't need to. So how do you fix it? Jesse asked. You've been quieter than usual since Danny's grocery store story processing, Emily could see, with the seriousness of someone who has realized this conversation is going to require something from him he didn't bring to the room. You practice noticing the picture, Emily said, not acting on it, just noticing it. You create a pause between the picture and the action. Even a half-second pause, even just the habit of asking, is this what's actually here or is this what I expect to be here? She paused. And then you practice in conditions where the cost of being wrong is low enough to tolerate but high enough to register. Like this room, Carter said. Like this room, Emily agreed. The first real test came 40 minutes in, and she hadn't planned it. Danny and Jesse ended up paired for a basic exercise. Emily had asked everyone to pair up with someone they didn't know, specifically across the veteran-student divide for a simple trust drill. Nothing physical. Just the exercise of standing close to someone unfamiliar and maintaining eye contact for 60 seconds without filling the space with performance. It sounded simple. It wasn't simple. Most of the pairs made it through with varying degrees of awkwardness and genuine effort. But Danny and Jesse had a problem. Jesse did something small, probably unconscious, the kind of behavioral tic that he didn't know he had and had no reason to know he had until this particular moment. He shifted his weight forward slightly toward Danny, at around the 30-second mark, just a degree or two. Danny's hand came up, not as a strike, not an attack, just up, in the space between them. An automatic barrier placed with a speed and precision that was startling in its economy. Jesse stepped back. His eyes went wide. Danny lowered his hand immediately. He looked at it, then at Jesse. I'm sorry, he said. The words came out flat and fast, like they'd been waiting behind a door and burst through before he could arrange them better. I'm sorry you moved forward and I didn't decide that. It's okay, Jesse said. And he meant it. Emily could hear that he meant it, but he was also shaken. The adrenaline still moving through him in a way that made his next breath slightly uneven. The room had stopped. Every pair had frozen. Everyone was watching Danny and Jesse. Danny looked at Emily. His face was controlled, but underneath the control was something raw and ashamed. And Emily recognized it, because she had felt it herself, the specific shame of your own nervous system, doing something that you didn't authorize and can't fully explain. That's it. Her voice was calm. Not loud. Not performative. Just steady and immediate, the voice she used when she needed a room to stay with her without escalating. Everyone looked at her. That's exactly it, she said. That's the thing we've been talking about. That just happened in real time. Did everyone see it? The room was perfectly still. Danny's system produced a response to a stimulus, Emily said. The response was automatic, it was fast, it was precise. It was completely calibrated to a threat environment that wasn't this room. She looked at Danny. And you noticed it, you recognized it before your hand had finished moving. Right? Danny looked at her. Yes. How long did it take you to recognize it 6 months ago? A pause. I usually didn't, he said quietly, until after. And now you recognized it during, Emily said. That's not nothing. That's not a small thing. That's the pause we've been talking about. She looked at Jesse. Are you okay? Jesse had reordered himself. He was shoulders back, the young athlete's unconscious reassembly of composure. Yeah, he said. Yeah, I'm fine. What did you feel? He hesitated, surprised, and then he stopped. Say it, Emily said. Scared, Jesse said. He said it plainly, without armor. and Emily could see that the plainness of it cost him something. For like a second, just instinct. Emily looked at both of them. Jesse, your instinct read a fast movement in close quarters as a threat. Instinct is correct. It has evolutionary validity. It has training validity. It did exactly what instincts are supposed to do. She paused. And Danny's instinct did the same thing. Two nervous systems, in the same moment, both producing accurate responses to stimuli, and both slightly wrong about what the stimuli actually meant. The room held that. This is the work, Emily said. Not eliminating the response. Not judging the response. Learning to look at the response and then look again at what's actually in front of you and close the gap between the two. Danny was looking at Jesse. I'm sorry, he said again, this time with more space in it. More of himself behind it. Jesse looked at him. You didn't do anything to be sorry for. I scared you. You surprised me, Jesse said. There's a difference. Something moved across Danny's face at that, not relief exactly, but something adjacent to it. The particular thing that happens when someone offers you a more accurate version of an event than the one you were carrying. Marcus, who had watched the entire exchange from across the room without moving, said quietly, he's right. Fear and surprise feel the same at the beginning, split apart about 2 seconds in. Everyone looked at Marcus. He looked back at them with the flat, steady gaze of someone who has spent a long time knowing things that other people are just beginning to figure out. 2 seconds is a lot, he said. After the session, Derek found Emily in the corridor. He had the look he'd had that first morning when he came in early working through something, turning it over, not finished yet. The drill with Danny and Jesse, he said. Yes, you didn't plan that, no, Emily said. But you used it. You use what the room gives you, Emily said. That's not a teaching technique, that's just paying attention. Derek was quiet for a moment. Then I spent 3 years running sessions in that room. Good sessions. Technical, structured, well-organized sessions. He looked at the mat through the window. I don't think I ever actually used what the room gave me. Emily looked at him. You were running the room. I'm trying to let the room run itself. Is that always better? It's always more honest, Emily said. Better is context dependent. He nodded. He looked at the mat again. Danny's going to be okay, he said. Not a question. Statement. But with something uncertain underneath it. He's already better than okay, Emily said. He noticed it during. 6 months ago, he didn't notice it until after. That's not a small shift. How long before it becomes before the noticing during becomes the stopping before? Emily looked at him. For some people, months. For some people, years, she paused. For some people, the noticing during is as far as it goes, and that's still a life that functions. And Danny? Emily thought about the way Danny had looked at Jesse, the specificity of his apology, the willingness to sit with the shame of it rather than deflect. Danny's going to get there, she said. He has the right relationship to his own discomfort. He doesn't run from it, he just hasn't known what to do with it. Derek absorbed that. What's the right relationship to discomfort, he asked. Emily looked at him steadily. You sit with it, you don't fix it. You don't explain it away. You just let yourself feel the full weight of it without deciding it means something catastrophic about who you are. Derek was quiet for a long moment. I had the wrong relationship to discomfort, he said. 4. You turned it into competition, Emily said. Made discomfort into something to overcome fastest. Hardest, most impressive discomfort as a thing to beat rather than a thing to learn from. She paused. That's a very common strategy, it's just not the most efficient one. He almost smiled. You're describing half the athletic world, I know, Emily said. Meant 8 years watching people use it in environments where the cost of that strategy was, she stopped. Higher. He heard what was in the stop. He didn't push past it. Thank you, he said, for this, for all of it. I mean that in a way that he shook his head. I don't have good enough words for it yet. You don't need words for it, Emily said. Just keep showing up. The twist came on a Thursday. 3 weeks into the joint program, 6 sessions in. Room had found its rhythm, not smooth, not easy, but real. The rhythm of people who had gotten used to being genuinely honest with each other and were starting to find out what became possible when you stopped performing. Danny had been coming early. He had started doing it in the second week, arriving 20 minutes before the session and sitting on a chair in the hallway outside the room, not talking to anyone, just sitting. Emily had noticed it and hadn't mentioned it. She understood what early arrival meant, because she did it herself. It meant the session mattered. It meant you were willing to want something. But on the Thursday of the 3rd week, Danny arrived early and he wasn't alone. He came in with a man Emily had never seen, late 20s. Compact, moving with the particular economy of someone who had been trained, but carrying something in his posture that was different from the veterans in the group. Something more constricted, more brittle, the posture of someone who was actively fighting their own body's desire to be somewhere else. Danny brought him straight to Emily. "This is Kyle," Danny said. "He was in my unit." Kyle looked at Emily. His eyes did the room assessment: exits, occupants, threat gradation in under 3 seconds, and then he seemed to catch himself doing it, and the awareness of being caught produced a brief, visible flash of something exhausted and frustrated in his face. "He won't go to the VA," Danny said. "Won't go to a therapist. Won't? He's not doing well." Kyle looked at Danny sharply. "2. He saved my life," Danny said. "Twice, and he's sleeping in his car because he can't." Danny stopped. His jaw tightened. "So won't asking for him." The hallway was very quiet. Kyle looked at the floor. His hands were at his sides and they were very still, the kind of stillness that takes active work to maintain. Emily looked at him. "You don't have to come in," she said. "Session starts in 20 minutes. You can sit out here. You can listen through the door. You can leave. None of those are wrong answers." Kyle looked up at her. "Danny says you were SEAL support," he said. 8 years, she said. "Did you have someone? When you got out? Someone who—" He stopped. "No," Emily said, "I didn't." "Was it bad?" "It was hard," she said. "For longer than it needed to be. Because I was doing it alone and I was too proud to say that I was drowning." Kyle looked at her with the expression of someone who has just heard their own internal experience described in words they didn't know existed for it. "Come in," Emily said, "just for tonight, just to see." Kyle looked at the door. He looked at Danny. Danny didn't say anything. He just looked back at Kyle with the steady, undemanding patience of someone who has decided to wait as long as it takes. Kyle looked at the floor. Then he walked through the door. That session was different from any that had come before. Kyle didn't speak for the first 40 minutes. He sat in the chair Danny pulled up for him just outside the circle, close enough to hear everything, far enough to feel like he could leave, and he listened. He watched. He did the room reading thing every few minutes, and each time Emily could see him notice himself doing it, and each time the noticing cost him something and he sat with the cost instead of leaving. At the 40-minute mark, Ray was talking about his daughter, the 9-year-old who watched him, the one he didn't know how to stop being a pressure system for. Kyle leaned forward. It was the first movement he had made other than the periodic room scanning. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and he looked at Ray with an intensity that made Ray stop talking mid-sentence. "How long has she been doing that?" Kyle said, the watching. Ray looked at him surprised, but not threatened. "About a year. Since I got back. My sister's kid does it with me," Kyle said. "She's 6. His voice was flat and careful, a voice as you get when the person speaking has decided to say a true thing and is holding themselves very steady to do it. "I went to her place for dinner 3 weeks ago and I knocked something off the counter. Just a glass hit the floor and Kyle stopped. His jaw worked briefly. He was across the room and he had his hands up before the glass stopped moving. 6 years old. He's already learned to brace. The room was completely still. "She's trying to protect him from me," Kyle said. "My sister. She still invites me, but she's also protecting him. And the worst part is she's right to." Nobody spoke. Emily watched Kyle sit with that truth, the specific, devastating truth of understanding that the people who love you most are simultaneously relieved you came home and quietly calculating how to manage the version of you that came back. "You can change that," Emily said. Kyle looked at her. "You know that for sure?" "I know it's possible," she said. "Don't promise outcomes. I've seen it happen. I've seen people create enough new experience that the old pattern stops being the only one available." "How long, Danny?" Emily said. "How long?" Danny looked at Kyle. 6 weeks ago I had Marcus against the dairy case in a grocery store." Kyle stared at him. "Tonight," Danny said, "Jesse moved fast next to me, and I noticed it during instead of after." "That's not, but it's different." Kyle looked at Jesse. Jesse looked back at him with the open, uncomplicated gaze of a 19-year-old who has been inside this room long enough to have lost most of his assumptions. "I've got nothing to be scared of from you," Jesse said. "I can see that." Kyle looked at him for a long moment. Something in Kyle's posture changed, not the dramatic release of a person letting go of a weight all at once, but the subtle incremental shift of someone deciding, tentatively and with significant reservations, to trust the room. He sat back in his chair. "Okay," he said. "Just that, just okay. But in that room with those people, with everything that word was carrying underneath it, it was enough. More than enough." After the session, Thomas found Emily. He had been in the doorway again. She had seen him at the 45-minute mark and noted his presence, and the particular expression on his face, something she couldn't quite classify, heavier than satisfaction and more complex than pride. He waited until the room had cleared before he came in. Sat down in one of the folding chairs. He was quiet for a moment. "Kyle Mercer," he said. Emily looked at him. "You know him?" "I know his file," Thomas said. "He was flagged 6 months ago by the outreach network. Classified as high risk. They've been trying to get him into a program for 5 months. 3 caseworkers, 2 program coordinators. Nobody could get close enough. Emily looked at the chair where Kyle had sat. Danny got close enough, she said. Because Danny was in this room, Thomas said. This room exists. He was quiet again then. Emily. What you're building here, he started again. I've been working in veteran support in some capacity for 12 years. I've seen programs, good ones, well-funded ones, evidence-based ones with solid research behind them. And none of them have done in 6 sessions what this room has done. Emily looked at him. It's not a program, that's why I know, he said. That's what I'm trying to tell you. What you're doing isn't a program. Something else. And I think, he paused carefully, I think it needs to be bigger than this building. Emily was very still. What does that mean, she said. It means I've been on the phone with the Veterans Outreach Network director twice this week, Thomas said. It means there are 6 facilities in 3 states that want to implement what you're doing. It means, he looked at her directly, it means there are a lot of Dannys, a lot of Kyles, and right now this room is one of the only places in the country where something real is happening for them. Emily looked at the mat. She thought about walking into this building 3 weeks ago, wanting to be invisible, wanting to be a beginner, wanting the particular relief of being in a room where nobody knew what she had been through or what she was capable of. She thought about Kyle sitting just outside the circle with his hands very still. She thought about Danny saying he saved my life, twice. She thought about what it had cost Kyle to walk through that door. And then she thought about the 6 facilities, the 3 states, the Dannys and the Kyles, and all of them sitting in parking lots, or in cars, or at kitchen tables at 3 in the morning, doing it alone because they didn't know that a room like this. I need time to think about it, she said. Take the time, Thomas said. I'll need help, she said. I can't do this alone. Derek, Marcus, Sonia. People who have been inside this room and understand what it actually is, I know, Thomas said. And I need it to stay real, she said. The moment it becomes a program, the moment there's a curriculum and a rubric and boxes to check, it stops working. I've seen it happen. I won't let that happen. Then don't let it, Thomas said. That's why it has to be you leading it. Emily looked at him. She thought about what her CO had said to her once, in the middle of the worst operational period she had ever lived through, when she had told him she didn't know if she was the right person for what was being asked of her. He had said, the question isn't whether you're the right person. The question is whether you're willing to become her. She had become her. She looked at Thomas. Let me talk to Danny and Kyle first, she said. Before anything else, they're not data points in a program development conversation. They're the reason this exists. Thomas nodded. Of course. Emily stood up. She looked around the room one more time, the folding chairs, the cold coffee, the particular quality of space that a room holds after real conversation has happened inside it. She thought about a parking lot in Northern Virginia. A woman sitting alone in a car at 6:43 in the morning, staring at a building and talking herself into something she told herself was simple. Nothing about it had been simple. Everything about it had been exactly right. Picked up her bag. She walked toward the door. For the first time in 3 years, she didn't check the exits on her way out. She talked to Danny first. The next morning, before anyone else arrived, before the building had filled with the particular sound of people moving through purposeful space, she called him. He picked up on the second ring, which told her he was already awake, which told her he had probably been awake for a while, which told her everything she needed to know about where he was right now. How's a pause? He slept on my couch last night. First time he slept inside in 3 weeks. Emily was quiet for a moment. How are you? I'm okay, Danny said. And then, because he had been inside her room long enough to know that okay was not an acceptable final answer, I'm tired, good tired, but tired. It costs something, watching someone you care about try to find their way back. It does, Emily said. You did the right thing bringing him. I didn't know what else to do, Danny said. I tried talking to him, I tried the VA referral, I just kept thinking, what's the one thing that changed for me? And it was the room. I brought him to the room. That's exactly the right instinct, Emily said. That's the thing I want to talk to you about. She told him what Thomas had said. The 6 facilities, the 3 states, the director. All of it plainly without packaging it as anything other than what it was. An opportunity that was also a responsibility, and a question she wasn't going to answer without the people who had built the room with her. Danny was silent for a long time after she finished. You're asking me if I think it should happen, he said. I'm asking what you think. Another silence. She could hear him breathing. Could hear the quality of thought in it. 6 weeks ago, Danny said slowly, I would have told you this was the only place like it. That it worked because it was small, because it was this specific group of people, because you can't replicate it somewhere else without losing whatever makes it real. He paused. I'd have been trying to protect it by keeping it small. And now? Emily said. Now I think about Kyle sleeping in his car, Danny said. And I think about how close he was to not walking through that door last night. And I think how many people are one bad week away from something that can't be undone. And the only reason it happens is because they don't know this room exists? Emily said nothing. It has to grow, Danny said, but you can't let it become a bureaucracy. The second it becomes something people process through. It's dead, I know, Emily said. You need people who've been in the room to run it. Not administrators, not program managers. People who know what the room actually is. I know that too, Emily said. Why, I'm calling you first. The line was quiet. What are you asking me, Emily? I'm asking if you want to be one of those people, she said. The silence that followed was the longest yet. She let it be what it was. She didn't fill it. She had learned, was still learning. Would always be learning that the most important answers needed the most space. Yeah, Danny said finally. His voice was rough and certain and entirely real. Yeah, I do. She called Sonia next. Then Marcus. Then she went to the academy and found Derek. He was teaching a morning session when she arrived, and she stood in the doorway and watched him for a few minutes before he saw her. He was running a combinations drill with 4 students, and the thing she noticed, the thing that was different from the Derek Lawson who had pointed at her across a training room 3 weeks ago, was the quality of his attention. He was watching the students the way she had taught him to watch, not for technique errors primarily, but for the persons underneath the technique. The hesitation that meant fear, the overextension that meant something to prove. The held breath that meant someone had stopped trusting their body. He caught a student mid-combination and said, "You're in your head. I can see it from here." The student, a teenage girl, maybe 16, with the guarded expression of someone who has learned to expect criticism rather than attention, looked startled. Nothing. You rushed the third movement, Derek said. But that's not the problem. You rushed it because something in you decided you were already behind. What decided that? The girl looked at him. She corrected me yesterday, she said. In front of everyone. And I keep thinking about it. Okay, Derek said. So you're training against yesterday's embarrassment instead of against the technique. He wasn't unkind about it. He was matter of fact, the way you are about something real. Those are 2 different opponents. One of them you can actually beat. The girl almost smiled. Emily stepped back from the doorway before he saw her. She waited in the corridor. When the session ended and the students filed out, Derek found her standing by the window. How long were you watching, he said. Long enough, she said. He looked at her with the ease of someone who has stopped being self-conscious about being observed. 3 weeks ago, that look would have had performance in it. Now it was just him. No extra layer. Thomas told you about the expansion, she said. It wasn't a question. He told me you were thinking about it, Derek said. He didn't tell me what you decided. I haven't decided yet, Emily said. I'm deciding now. By talking to the people who have to be part of it. Derek leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, then deliberately uncrossed. She had watched him break that habit over the course of 3 weeks, the self-correction becoming faster each time until now it was nearly instantaneous. What does it mean for the academy, he asked. Nothing changes here, Emily said. The joint sessions stay. This is the origin, not the template. Every other location adapts to what its own room needs. No 2 rooms will be identical because no 2 groups of people are identical. Who runs the other locations? People who've been through this one, she said. Veterans who are far enough along to sit with someone who's where they used to be. Students who've spent enough time in these sessions to understand what they're actually inside. She looked at him, and Derek looked at her. Me, he said. You've changed more in 3 weeks than some people change in 3 years, Emily said. Not because I did something to you, because you were willing. Because when the room handed you something hard, you stayed in it. She paused. That's the quality I'm looking for, not expertise. Willingness. I'm 26 years old, he said. I've never done anything like this. Neither had I, Emily said. The first time I did something that changed my life. He looked at the mat through the window. She watched him turn it over, the real version, not the quick, confident acceptance that the old Derek would have produced. The version that cost something, that acknowledged the size of what was being offered and the weight of what it asked in return. I'm in, he said. Fully, no performance in it. Good, Emily said. The meeting with the Veterans Outreach Network director happened 10 days later. His name was Richard Caldwell. He was 54 years old. Former Army colonel, had spent the last 8 years building the organization from a regional referral network into a nationally recognized support infrastructure. He was the kind of man who had learned to get things done inside institutions without becoming an institution himself, a particular skill that Emily recognized and respected. because she had watched it from the inside during her service years and understood how rare it actually was. He flew in from D.C. and Thomas brought him to the academy on a Tuesday morning. Emily met them at the door. Richard shook her hand and looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated assessment of someone who spent his professional life evaluating people quickly and accurately. She let him look. She was used to being assessed. She assessed him back with the same frankness and saw a man who genuinely cared about what he was building, who was smart enough to know the difference between a program that helped and a program that looked like it helped, and who was tired, a specific kind of tired that comes from spending years fighting institutional inertia on behalf of people who needed things the institution wasn't designed to provide. "Tell me about the room," he said, "not the program." The room, she liked that. They sat down and she told him. Not the version that sounded like a pitch. The version that was true. Danny in the parking garage. Kyle in his car. Jesse and the question of whether fear and surprise were the same thing. Carter pulling up a folding chair and sitting down on a Thursday night because something she had said in a training session had refused to leave him alone. Richard listened without interrupting for 22 minutes. When she finished, he was quiet. "What do you need?" he said. "People over infrastructure," Emily said. "Funding for training the people who run the rooms. Not for building the rooms. The rooms can be anywhere. The people who run them are the variable that matters." "What's the training look like?" "They come here first," Emily said. "They sit in this room for a minimum of 2 months. They don't run anything, they observe, they participate. They make mistakes in a low-stakes environment. And then they go to their location and they start small, 6 people maximum, and they build from what the room gives them rather than from a curriculum." Richard looked at Thomas. Thomas nodded once. Richard looked back at Emily. "The network has tried 3 structured veteran transition programs in the last 4 years," he said. "We've poured significant resources into all of them. They produce good metrics, good completion rates, good survey scores, good outcomes on paper." He paused. "The recidivism rate on the actual underlying issues is terrible. People complete the program, and then 18 months later they're in exactly the place they were before, because they learn to navigate the program without the program ever touching the actual problem. Because the actual problem isn't a skills deficit," Emily said. "It's a perception deficit. They don't need more strategies for managing civilian life. They need to be seen by someone who knows what they're managing. And they need to accumulate enough genuine experience of being accurately perceived that their nervous system starts to recalibrate what safety feels like." Richard looked at her for a long moment. "You understand that what you're describing is very hard to scale," he said. "I know," Emily said. "That's why we scale it slowly. People per room. 8 rooms maximum in year 1. We do it right or we don't do it. 8 rooms is not a large number. 8 rooms is 48 people," Emily said. "If we do it right, those 48 people become the next round of room facilitators. If we do it wrong, we produce 48 people who completed a program and are exactly where they were before." She held his gaze. "I will not build something that looks like help and isn't." The room was quiet. Richard looked at her with the expression of a man who has been fighting a particular battle for a long time and has just met someone who understands the terrain from the inside. "All right," he said. "All right meaning yes," Emily said. "All right meaning yes," Richard said, "on your terms. We'll need a memorandum of understanding that protects the model integrity. I don't want a regional director deciding to streamline the process in year 2 and losing everything that makes it work." "Agreed," Emily said. "And I want the right to shut down any room that drifts from the model. Non-negotiable." Richard looked at Thomas. Thomas kept his face completely neutral in the way of someone who is privately very pleased with how this is going. "Non-negotiable," Richard agreed. Emily looked at the table for a moment. He thought about the car, the parking lot. 6:43 in the morning. A woman who had told herself she was just going in to learn something. She thought about how long it had taken her to understand that you don't choose your purpose. You just keep moving honestly, and eventually you find yourself standing inside it. "One more thing," she said. Richard waited. "The veterans who come through these rooms, they're not participants in a program. They're not cases. They're people who built something real in service to this country and came home to a world that didn't have a framework for who they'd become." She looked at Richard steadily. "The way we talk about them inside the organization matters. The language matters. I want that in the agreement." Richard looked at her for a long moment. "Done," he said. The night before, the first room outside the academy opened a facility in Richmond, 80 miles south, run by a former Marine named Gabriella who had spent 6 weeks sitting in Emily's room before she was ready. Danny called. It was late. Emily was at her kitchen table, the same table where she had filled out the registration form 3 weeks before joining the academy. She looked at the phone and thought full circle. Then she picked up. You nervous? Danny asked. About Richmond? About all of it. Emily thought about it honestly. The way she thought about everything now, without the layer of performance that used to sit between her and her own inner life. Yes, she said. Good, Danny said. She smiled. That's what I said to Derek when he told me he was scared about running his first joint session. Did it help? He said no, Emily said. But he showed up anyway. Danny laughed a real laugh. The kind she had not heard from him in the first 2 weeks of the room. The kind that told her something about where he was now versus where he had been. Kyle starts at the Richmond room next week, Danny said. I know, Emily said. Gabriella's good. He'll be in the right place. He asked me something today, Danny said. He asked how long before he stops being before the work, stops feeling like work, and starts feeling like just living. A pause. I didn't know what to tell him. Emily thought about this. What did you tell him? I told him I'd ask you. Emily looked at the wall. She thought about what the true answer was, not the answer that sounded right, not the answer that would be easiest for Kyle to carry, but the actual, honest, earned truth of it. Tell him it stops feeling like work the day he realizes he's been living for a while without noticing, she said. Not because the work ended, because it became part of him. The noticing during becomes so fast it doesn't feel like an extra step anymore. The pause between stimulus and response becomes so natural it doesn't feel like a pause. It just feels like being a person who has a choice. The line was quiet. When did that happen for you? Danny asked. Emily thought about leaving the academy the night of the expansion meeting. Walking to her car, being in the parking lot and realizing, 20 minutes later, that she had not cataloged the exits on her way out. Happening, she said. I'll let you know when it's done. Danny was quiet for a moment. Thank you, he said, for the room, for bringing Kyle in. Before he stopped, she could hear him deciding how much of the rest to say. He decided to say all of it. For being the kind of person who could have stayed invisible and chose not to. Emily looked at her kitchen table. I didn't choose it, she said. I just ran out of reasons to hide. 3 months later, Emily stood at the back of the academy training hall and watched Derek run a joint session. He ran it the way she had taught him, which is to say he didn't run it at all. He held the space he noticed. He used what the room gave him. When a student said something that touched a veteran's experience in a way that could have gone wrong, Derek caught it with the quiet precision of someone who had been watching people for 3 months with his full attention instead of his performance, and had learned to see the difference between a moment that needed intervention and a moment that needed to be allowed to complete itself. He let it complete itself. The student and the veteran worked it out between them. Carter was in the room. He sat next to a veteran named Louis who had arrived 2 weeks ago and was still in the outer circle stage, not speaking much, taking inventory, deciding whether to trust. Carter had figured this out within the first session and had made a series of quiet, deliberate choices in Lewis's direction, always leaving the chair next to him open, never addressing him directly in front of the group, once spending 40 minutes after a session talking to him in the corridor about nothing in particular: cars, the weather, a football game, until Lewis's shoulders dropped half an inch and he stopped calculating exits every 3 minutes. Emily had watched that without commenting. She had understood that Carter was doing the thing she had taught, or rather, the thing he had learned by being in the room, which was different and better than being taught. He was being accurately present to a person who needed someone to be accurately present to them without agenda or expectation or a program to run. He was doing it because it was the right thing to do. Not for a grade, not for recognition, because he had spent enough time in a room where real things happened to real people that his own internal calibration had shifted. That was the whole point. That had always been the whole point. Priya was leading a section of the session now. Emily had started bringing her in as a junior facilitator in the 4th week. Because Priya had the quality that the work required in abundance, she listened to understand rather than to respond. She sat with silence without trying to fill it, and she had the particular courage of someone young who has decided to take something seriously before the world has given them permission to. She was 20 years old. She was extraordinary. Derek caught Emily's eye from across the room. Didn't smile, he didn't nod. He just looked at her for a moment, direct, steady. The look of someone who has something to say and is choosing to say it without words, because words would be insufficient anyway. She looked back at him the same way. That was enough. Afterward, when the room had cleared and the chairs were being stacked against the wall, Thomas found her. He always found her after the sessions, and she had come to understand that this was his version of the room, these brief conversations in the aftermath, when everything was real and nobody was performing, when the distance between what people meant and what they said had closed to almost nothing. Richard called me today, Thomas said. Emily looked at him. The Richmond room, he said. He got preliminary data back from the network's assessment team. She waited. Kyle Mercer showed up to every session for 3 weeks, Thomas said. He got an apartment last month. He started a job last week, electrician's apprentice. He called his sister. Emily was very still. He called her, Thomas said. First time in 8 months. He told her he was working on it. He told her he wanted to take his nephew to a baseball game when he was ready. The training hall was quiet around them. Emily looked at the mat. She thought about Kyle sitting just outside the circle. His hands very still, the exhausted, brittle quality of his posture. The way he had said okay, just that single word, carrying the weight of a person deciding, against significant internal resistance, to try one more time. Not fixed, Thomas said. Nobody in this work is fixed. But he's different, Emily said. Yes, Thomas said. He's different. She nodded. She was not going to cry in the training hall. She had a long-established personal policy on this subject. But she felt the weight of it in the way she felt important things in her chest, specific and real and impossible to dismiss. That's why we do it, she said. Yes, Thomas said. They stood there for a moment in the quiet of the room. Then Thomas said, Can I ask you something? You've asked me things in this building every day for 3 months, Emily said. You don't need permission, he almost smiled. The night you walked in here, he said. The very first morning, before the class, before Derek, before any of it. You sat in your car for almost 10 minutes, Emily looked at him. I saw you from my office window, he said. I watched you sit there. And I want to know, what were you thinking about? She looked at the mat. She thought about what she had actually been thinking about. 6:43 in the morning, before any of it had happened. The truth of it. Not the version that made a good story. The real one. I was thinking about whether I was ready to stop hiding, she said. And I was trying to decide if there was a version of being in the world that didn't require me to be invisible. She paused. I didn't have an answer. I was just sitting with the question. Thomas was quiet. And now, he said. Emily looked around the room, at the folding chairs, at the mat, at the equipment lockers where Derek had found her the second morning and asked the questions that had opened everything up, at the door where Kyle had stood for a long moment, deciding. She thought about Danny laughing on the phone, Priya leading a section, Carter and Louis talking about nothing in a corridor for 40 minutes until Lewis's shoulders came down. She thought about 8 rooms, 48 people. The agreement that said they are not cases, they are people. He thought about a little boy with his hands up before a glass finished hitting the floor, who would be okay now, because Kyle had walked through a door, because Danny had asked the right question, because Emily had finally, 3 years after she needed to, run out of reasons to be invisible. Now I have an answer, she said. Thomas looked at her. She looked back at him with the direct, clear, uncomplicated gaze that she had spent 3 weeks teaching and 3 years learning and 8 years before, that earning in environments that most people would never have to imagine. You don't survive the things I survived to disappear, she said. You survive them so you know how to stand in a room with someone who's drowning and not flinch. You can say, I've been there. I know what that water feels like. And I know there's ground underneath it. She paused. You survive so you can be the ground. The training hall was completely still. Thomas Reed, who had spent 30 years around people who had done hard things and carried them well, looked at Emily Dawson and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said. She picked up her bag. She walked to the door. She pushed it open. And Emily Dawson, the woman who had walked into this building 3 months ago wanting only to be invisible, who had instead become the ground that other people stood on, walked out into the morning without checking a single exit, because she had finally completely and without reservation come home to herself. Some people survived to disappear. Emily Dawson survived to be found. And in being found, she became the reason others stopped being lost.